In the heart of a small farming town, where corn fields stretched as far as the eye could see, lived a young man who would later become one of the military's most overlooked heroes. Growing up among the endless rows of crops, he learned the value of hard work and perseverance from his father, a Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke of his service but whose quiet dignity spoke volumes. The year was 2008, and at just 19 years old, he enlisted in the army, leaving behind the only life he'd ever known. His mother cried at the bus station, pressing a small silver cross into his palm, a family heirloom that had belonged to his grandfather. His father stood tall, offering a firm handshake that conveyed more emotion than words ever could. Basic training tested every fiber of his being. While others complained about the grueling routines, he remained silent, pushing through each challenge with unwavering determination. His drill sergeant noticed this quiet resilience, noting how he would always be the first to help struggling fellow recruits, often sacrificing his own rest time to ensure everyone succeeded as a team. Deployment came sooner than expected. The scorching heat of Afghanistan's Kandahar province was a far cry from the gentle warmth of his hometown summers. But he adapted, as he always did, earning the respect of his unit through his actions rather than words. They called him Shadow, not because he was stealthy, but because he was always there when someone needed backup, appearing like a guardian spirit in the most crucial moments. One particularly challenging mission changed everything. Their convoy was passing through what intelligence had deemed a secure route when the first IED detonated. The explosion rocked their vehicle, sending it careening off the dusty road. Through the chaos and smoke, he remained clear-headed, his training kicking in instinctively. What happened next would later be described in official reports as extraordinary valor under extreme circumstances, though these words hardly captured the reality of those harrowing moments. As enemy fire rained down from hidden positions, he noticed the fuel tank of their disabled vehicle was leaking. Without hesitation, he moved to evacuate his injured teammates, making multiple trips through the kill zone. The situation worsened when he spotted movement in a nearby building, civilians trapped by the firefight. Despite the obvious risks, he knew he couldn't leave them behind. Using the smoke from the burning vehicle as cover, he managed to guide 3 local children and their grandmother to safety, all while coordinating with his team to maintain suppressive fire. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found him treating the wounds of both his fellow soldiers and the civilians he'd rescued, using supplies from his own medical kit. His uniform was torn and bloodied, though he hadn't even noticed his own injuries until a medic pointed them out. The aftermath should have been straightforward, a clear case of heroism deserving recognition. Yet somehow, in the complex machinery of military bureaucracy, his actions that day were reduced to a brief mention in an after-action report. His immediate superiors recommended him for commendation, but as the paperwork moved up the chain of command, it became lost in a sea of similar recommendations. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. He never complained about the lack of recognition, returning to his duties with the same quiet dedication that had always characterized his service. To him, the real reward was knowing those children would have a future, that his teammates had made it home to their families. He kept their thank you letters in his footlocker, reading them on particularly difficult nights when the memories wouldn't let him sleep. Life continued this way until a routine ceremony was scheduled at the base. It was meant to be a standard affair, the usual presentations of service medals and routine commendations. Nobody, least of all him, expected what was about to unfold. As he stood in formation, tugging slightly at his collar in the morning heat, he had no idea that his life was about to change forever. The morning of the ceremony dawned bright and clear, much like that fateful day in Kandahar. Base personnel bustled about, preparing the parade ground with the precision expected of military affairs. Rows of white chairs faced a simple wooden podium, while family members of those being honored filed in, their excitement palpable in the morning air. Our hero stood at attention in formation, his uniform pressed to perfection, not because he expected recognition, but because anything less would dishonor the uniform he wore. His thoughts drifted to his hometown, where his parents would be starting their daily routine. He hadn't told them about the ceremony. There seemed no point in having them travel all this way just to see him stand in formation. What he didn't know was that behind the scenes, something extraordinary had been unfolding for months. A journalist embedded with another unit had heard whispers of his actions in Kandahar. Intrigued, she had begun digging, interviewing members of his unit, tracking down the Afghan family he had saved, and uncovering the buried paperwork of his commendation. The story she pieced together was far more remarkable than even the initial reports suggested. The grandmother he'd saved turned out to be a respected village elder, and in the months following the incident, she had helped establish crucial relationships between U.S. forces and local communities, saving countless lives through improved intelligence sharing. The children he'd rescued had shared their story throughout their village, changing hearts and minds in a way that no official military campaign could have achieved. One of them, inspired by his actions, was now working as a translator for coalition forces, building bridges between cultures. His fellow soldiers had their own stories to tell. The driver of the destroyed vehicle, now recovered and stationed stateside, credited him with not only saving his life but also helping him through the darkest days of his rehabilitation. "He visited me every day in the hospital," the driver had told the journalist. "He'd read me letters from my kids, helped me with physical therapy, and never once mentioned that he was the reason I was alive to begin with." As the ceremony began, the base commander took the podium, beginning with the usual formalities. Our hero stood stoically, expecting another routine proceeding. Then, something changed. The commander's voice took on a different tone as he began speaking about valor, about actions that go above and beyond the call of duty. The crowd stirred as several distinguished visitors were introduced. Among them was the Secretary of the Army, who had flown in specifically for this occasion. But what truly caught our hero off guard was the sight of his parents being escorted to the front row. His father, still proud and straight-backed despite his years, wore his own service medals. His mother clutched a handkerchief, her eyes already brimming with tears. The base fell silent as the commander began reading the citation. With each word, our hero's heart beat faster as he realized they were describing that day in Kandahar. The details were all there: the ambush, the rescue, the civilians, everything he had tried so hard to forget but that visited him in his dreams. Then, from the crowd emerged familiar faces he never expected to see again. The Afghan grandmother, now wearing a dignified blue headscarf, stood with her grandchildren, all of them smiling through tears. His former unit members, some he hadn't seen since that day, stood at attention in full dress uniform. Even the hospital staff who had witnessed his daily visits to his injured comrade were present. The journalist who had uncovered his story sat quietly in the back, her notebook closed for once. She had done her part, now it was time for the story to tell itself. The truth of his actions, long overlooked but never forgotten by those whose lives he had touched, was finally coming to light. As the commander continued speaking, it became clear that this was no ordinary ceremony. This was a moment of reckoning, a time when all the quiet heroism and unsung dedication would finally be acknowledged. But even as the revelation began to unfold, our hero remained humble, his thoughts not on the recognition he was about to receive, but on the faces of those he had helped, the true medals he carried in his heart. The next few moments would shake the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about his service, about recognition, and about the impact one person's actions could have on the world. The Secretary of the Army stepped forward, holding a small blue box that seemed to command the attention of everyone present. The morning sun caught the metallic gleam of what lay inside, sending a flash across the parade ground. Our hero's throat tightened as he recognized the distinct shape of the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration awarded for extreme gallantry and risk of life in combat. But that wasn't all. As the citation continued, it became clear that his actions had sparked a chain of events far beyond that day in Kandahar. The grandmother he'd saved had become instrumental in establishing a girls' school in her village. The military had worked with her, using her influence to create a safe space for education in an area where such opportunities had been rare. The translator, one of the children he'd rescued, stepped forward to speak. In perfect English, he described how that day had changed not just his life, but the lives of countless others. "In my village," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "we tell stories of angels who appear in times of need. But that day, we learned that sometimes angels wear combat boots and carry medical kits." His words brought tears to many eyes, but the revelations weren't finished. The base commander unveiled a series of photographs on a large screen. They showed the impact of the grandmother's work, young girls in school uniforms, women attending community meetings, and most surprisingly, a medical clinic built through joint military-civilian cooperation, bearing a plaque with our hero's unit number. Then came the letters. Hundreds of them, collected over months, from soldiers he'd served with, civilians he'd helped, and families whose lives he'd touched. They spoke of small kindnesses, how he'd taught English to local children during his off hours, how he'd organized care packages for the village, how he'd written letters home for injured comrades. Each small act, unremarkable on its own, had woven together into a tapestry of compassion that had changed an entire community. His former commanding officer stepped up to speak next. "In all my years of service," he began, his voice gruff with emotion, "I've never seen paperwork get lost at every level of command quite like this one did. It's almost as if someone up there wanted us to wait, to see the full impact of these actions unfold before we honored them properly." The officer gestured to a group of people standing off to the side, representatives from various humanitarian organizations. They had come because the school and clinic had become models for similar projects across the region. What had started as one soldier's split-second decision to help had grown into something that was changing lives across multiple villages. Our hero stood at attention, his eyes fixed forward, but his mind was spinning. He thought of those moments in Kandahar, how simple the choice had seemed then. People needed help, so he helped. That was all. He had never imagined that such straightforward decisions could ripple outward, touching so many lives in so many ways. His mother in the front row was openly crying now, clutching his father's hand. His father, the Vietnam veteran who rarely showed emotion, had tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. They were hearing for the first time the full extent of their son's actions, understanding finally why he had seemed different after returning home, carrying not just the weight of that day, but the responsibility of all the lives he'd influenced. The Secretary of the Army approached, and as protocol dictated, our hero stepped forward. The Distinguished Service Cross was only the beginning. There were commendations from the Afghan government, letters of appreciation from international organizations, and something that touched him more than all the medals, a handmade book of drawings from the students at the girls' school, each page expressing gratitude in colorful childish scrawls. But just as the ceremony seemed to be reaching its conclusion, there was one final surprise. A video began playing on the screen, showing faces familiar and strange, each with a story to tell about the quiet soldier who had changed their lives. Among them was a small girl, now a teenager, who had been one of the children he'd saved. She spoke directly to the camera in careful English. "Some people call him a hero because of one day, one action. But for us, he is a hero because he showed us how to be brave in small ways, every day." As the video played on, our hero felt something shift inside him. All these years, he had carried the weight of that day in Kandahar, thinking it was a burden. Now he was beginning to understand that it had been a gift, not just to those he'd helped, but to himself. The ceremony had unleashed something powerful, not just recognition of past deeds, but a vision of how single acts of courage could transform entire communities. As our hero stood there, the weight of his medals new on his chest, a young lieutenant approached the podium. She was from the Pentagon's Community Relations Department, and what she revealed next left the audience in stunned silence. The military had been tracking the success of the village's transformation. The girls' school had achieved a 100% graduation rate, with many students going on to become teachers, nurses, and community leaders. The medical clinic had treated over 10,000 patients in the past year alone. But most remarkably, neighboring villages had begun adopting similar programs, creating a ripple effect of positive change throughout the region. The lieutenant clicked to a new slide, showing a map dotted with green points of light. Each of these points, she explained, represents a new school or clinic established using the model from your village. The screen was illuminated with dozens of points, spreading like stars across the landscape of Afghanistan. This is what we call the shadow effect, she continued, using his old nickname, named after the soldier who proved that compassion can be as powerful as any weapon in winning hearts and minds. Our hero's former platoon sergeant stepped forward next, his voice thick with emotion as he shared a story never before told. On the night after the rescue, when everyone thought their hero was finally resting, he had actually been writing letters, not just to the families of his injured comrades, but to his own family. Not about his actions, but asking them to send children's books, school supplies, and medical kits. He had been planning the next step even before the dust had settled. The sergeant pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, the original letter, kept all these years. He wrote, "Mom, Dad, I know this might sound strange, but I need your help. Today I saw how much difference a few moments of kindness can make. I think we can do more." The sergeant's voice cracked. He wasn't just thinking about the rescue, he was already planning how to build something lasting from it. A group of military doctors then shared their findings. The community programs spawned from that initial act had led to a 60% reduction in preventable diseases in the region, a 40% increase in childhood vaccination rates, and unprecedented cooperation between military medical teams and local healthcare workers. Sometimes, one doctor noted, the best defense against extremism is a child who grows up knowing that someone from another world cared enough to help. The Afghan grandmother, who had been quietly watching, rose to speak through her translator. Her words carried the weight of ancient wisdom. In our culture, we have a saying, "A single candle can light 1,000 others." This soldier was our first candle. Look now at how the light has spread. She gestured to a group of young women in the audience, the first graduating class from the girls' school. They stood, dressed in a mixture of traditional clothes and modern professional attire. One was now a doctor at the clinic, another a teacher, a third working with international aid organizations. Each represented a dream that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. The base commander returned to the podium with another surprise. A foundation, inspired by these events, had been established to support similar initiatives worldwide. It would focus on regions where small acts of compassion could bridge cultural divides and create lasting change. The Foundation's first project? Building a medical training center in the original village, where local women could study to become healthcare workers. Our hero listened to all this with growing amazement. His mind went back to that day in Kandahar, the heat, the fear, the split-second decisions. He had acted then on instinct, driven by the simple belief that every life was worth saving. Never had he imagined that saving those lives would create such far-reaching change. His father, the quiet Vietnam veteran, finally rose to speak. His voice, usually so reserved, rang out clear and strong. "My son never told us what happened that day. But every care package we sent, every book, every medical supply, he made sure we knew exactly how they were helping. He didn't want recognition for the rescue, he wanted support for what came after." The audience was shown another video, this one featuring time-lapse footage of the village's transformation over the years. Buildings rose, gardens grew, and most strikingly, the faces of the people changed. Where there had once been suspicion and fear, there was now hope and purpose. The camera panned across classrooms full of eager students, clinics serving long lines of patients, and community meetings where women and men worked together to build a better future. But even as the achievements were being celebrated, our hero's mind was already turning to the future. He saw not just what had been accomplished, but what was still possible. In his heart, a new mission was taking shape, one that would prove that the greatest acts of heroism sometimes come not in moments of dramatic rescue, but in the quiet, persistent work of building something lasting. As the ceremony continued, a group of international aid workers took the stage to share something unexpected. They had been tracking similar initiatives around the world, looking for what they called catalyst moments, instances where a single act of courage sparked lasting social change. What had happened in that small Afghan village had become a case study in sustainable community transformation. One aid worker, a veteran of countless global crises, shared data that left the audience speechless. The model that had grown from our heroes' actions had been adapted for use in other conflict zones. Programs inspired by the village's success were now operating in 12 different countries, each adapted to local needs but built on the same foundation of trust and mutual respect. The Secretary of the Army revealed another layer to the story. Military strategists had been studying what they now called the compassion doctrine, the idea that genuine acts of humanity could achieve what force alone never could. What we witnessed here, he explained, wasn't just a successful community program. It was a paradigm shift in how we think about military-civilian relationships in conflict zones. Our hero's mother, still dabbing at her eyes, stood to share her perspective. She spoke of the hundreds of care packages they had helped coordinate over the years, how their small farming community had rallied around the cause. Local schools had organized book drives, church groups had collected medical supplies, and farmers had contributed what they could. Their small town had become connected to a village on the other side of the world, bound by threads of compassion and common humanity. The base chaplain stepped forward with yet another revelation. The small silver cross our hero's mother had given him at the bus station, he had passed it on to the Afghan grandmother the day of the rescue. She reached into her headscarf and pulled out the very same cross, worn smooth by years of worried fingers. He told me, she said through her translator, that it had protected his family for generations, and now it would protect mine. This simple act of giving away a family heirloom spoke volumes about our hero's character. It wasn't just about saving lives in the moment, it was about believing in a future where such protection wouldn't be necessary. The cross had become a symbol of something larger, the possibility of faith transcending boundaries of culture and religion to touch the basic human desire for peace and security. A group of young soldiers, fresh from training, sat in rapt attention as their commanding officer explained how this story had been incorporated into their preparation for deployment. We teach them about weapons and tactics, he said, but we also teach them about this, about how the greatest victories sometimes come from seeing the humanity in those we're sent to protect. The screen behind the podium changed to show live video feeds from some of the other programs around the world. A medical clinic in Somalia, a school in Yemen, a community center in Iraq, each one built on the principles that had proved so successful in that first village. In each location, local leaders spoke about how these programs had changed their communities, not through force or coercion, but through genuine partnership and respect. Our hero's father, who had been quietly observing everything, finally shared a story that put it all in perspective. He spoke of the day his son returned from deployment, how he had found him sitting in the old barn, looking at photos of the village children. He told me something I'll never forget, his father said, voice steady despite his emotion. He said, "Dad, we think war is about winning battles, but sometimes it's about showing people there's something worth building peace for." The journalist who had uncovered the story revealed that she had initially been skeptical. In our cynical world, she admitted, acts of pure altruism are often met with suspicion. But what I found here was something rare, authentic goodness that inspired others not just to admire, but to act. As the afternoon sun began to slant across the parade ground, the base commander made one final announcement. The military was establishing a new training program, named after our hero, focused on community engagement and humanitarian response. Future soldiers would learn not just from his actions during the rescue, but from the years of quiet, dedicated work that followed. The Afghan grandmother's eldest grandchild, now a young woman studying medicine, stepped forward to make her own announcement. The clinic in their village would be expanding, adding a training center where local women could study nursing and healthcare. But more importantly, she said in clear, confident English, we will teach them what we learned from our American friend, that the bravest thing you can do is believe in the possibility of a better future, and work every day to build it. Our hero stood at attention through all of this, his posture perfect but his mind racing. He was beginning to understand that his legacy wouldn't be measured in medals or commendations, but in the countless lives touched by the ripples of that one decisive moment. Yet even now, he was thinking ahead, seeing new possibilities, new ways to expand on what had been built. The ceremony had moved beyond simple recognition of past deeds, it had become a moment of transformation, a bridge between what was and what could be. As the afternoon progressed, more surprises emerged that would leave an indelible mark on everyone present. A group of military strategists presented their analysis of what they called the Shadow Protocol, a comprehensive approach to community engagement inspired by our hero's actions. They had discovered that regions where this approach had been implemented showed significant decreases in violent incidents and marked increases in cooperation with local authorities. The data was clear. Compassion wasn't just morally right, it was strategically effective. The Afghan grandmother's youngest grandchild, now a teenager, shared a story that brought tears to even the most hardened veteran's eyes. She spoke of how, in the years following the rescue, our hero had sent her letters filled with English lessons and encouragement. He never wrote about the day he saved us, she said, her English clear and confident. Instead, he wrote about the future, about all the things we could become, all the ways we could help others. He made us believe in possibilities we had never imagined. A senior Pentagon official stepped forward with an unprecedented announcement. The military was establishing a new division dedicated to humanitarian operations and community development, directly inspired by the success of what had started in that small village. We're calling it the Bridge Division, he explained, because it will focus on building connections between military operations and civilian needs, just as our hero did instinctively that day in Kandahar. The base medical officer shared findings that highlighted the broader impact of these initiatives. In regions where similar programs had been implemented, there was a marked decrease in post-traumatic stress among soldiers. When our troops can see the positive change they're creating, she explained, when they can build instead of just defend, it gives their service a deeper meaning. It helps them carry the weight of their experiences in a healthier way. Our hero's mother revealed something she had kept private until now. Every month since his return, her son had been sending a portion of his military pay to support educational programs in the village. Not just to the original school, but to new initiatives that had sprung up around it. He never wanted recognition, she said, her voice steady despite her tears. He just wanted to make sure that what started there would continue to grow. The screen behind the podium lit up with live video connections to military bases around the world where similar programs were being implemented. From South Korea to Germany, from Japan to Africa, soldiers shared how they had been inspired by this story to start their own community initiatives. Each one was unique, adapted to local needs, but all shared the same core principle, that the strongest bridges between peoples are built through acts of genuine compassion. A surprise video message played from a renowned peace negotiator who had studied the village's transformation. He explained how the model had influenced his approach to conflict resolution in other regions. What we learned here, he said, is that peace isn't just about ending violence, it's about creating something worth preserving. When people see their children learning, their sick being cared for, their community growing stronger, they become invested in maintaining that peace. The base commander shared a personal observation that captured the essence of our hero's impact. In the military, he said, we often talk about force multipliers, things that increase our effectiveness. What we've witnessed here is a hope multiplier. Each person touched by these programs goes on to touch others, creating an endless chain of positive change. Our hero's father, who had remained stoic throughout most of the ceremony, finally rose again to share something that put everything in perspective. He pulled out a worn notebook, his son's journal from his deployment. With permission, he read an entry written the night after the rescue. "Today I learned that courage isn't just about facing danger. It's about facing the possibility that we can do more, be more, help more than we ever thought possible. And once you see that possibility, you can't unsee it. You have to act on it." The Afghan translator who had been helping throughout the ceremony added his own insight. He explained how the village had changed not just physically, but spiritually. "Before, we saw foreigners as either enemies or saviors," he said. "Now we understand that we are all just people, capable of helping each other, capable of building something beautiful together." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parade ground, the base chaplain led a moment of reflection. People of different faiths, cultures, and backgrounds stood together, united by the simple truth that had driven our heroes' actions, that humanity's capacity for compassion knows no boundaries. But even as the ceremony seemed to be winding down, there was a stirring at the back of the crowd. A group of people had arrived, unexpected guests whose presence would add yet another layer of meaning to this already extraordinary day. The unexpected arrivals made their way through the crowd, creating a ripple of whispers. They were leaders from various villages across Afghanistan, each representing communities that had been transformed by programs inspired by our heroes' initial actions. But they hadn't come alone, they had brought something with them that would add an extraordinary dimension to the day's events. The first to speak was a village elder, his traditional robes dusty from travel. Through a translator, he explained that word of this ceremony had spread through their communities, and they had undertaken long journeys to be here. "We come bearing witness," he said, "not just to one day of heroism, but to years of quiet change that followed." They had brought with them a massive tapestry, handwoven by women from dozens of villages. As it was carefully unrolled, gasps of amazement swept through the crowd. The tapestry told a story, not just of the rescue, but of everything that had grown from it. Intricate patterns showed schools being built, clinics opening, and communities coming together. The border was decorated with the names of every graduate from every school that had been established. A young woman stepped forward, one of the tapestry's weavers. She explained how each village had contributed a section, weaving their own stories of transformation into the larger narrative. The patterns used traditional Afghan designs, but incorporated new symbols representing education, healthcare, and cooperation. "This is not just art," she said in carefully practiced English, "this is our living history." The base commander announced that the tapestry would be displayed at the Pentagon, but with a unique twist, it would be accompanied by an interactive display showing real-time updates from all the programs it represented. This way, he explained, it will be both a historical record and a living document of ongoing change. Our hero's mother, looking at the tapestry, shared something she had never told anyone. In the weeks after her son's return, she had noticed him sitting up late at night, writing in a notebook. One night, she had glimpsed a page. It wasn't a diary, but a detailed plan for community development, written while the memories of Kandahar were still fresh. He wasn't dwelling on what had happened, she said. He was planning for what could happen next. The Afghan grandmother who had been saved that day stepped forward again, this time carrying a small, wooden box. Inside was a collection of seeds from her village's first community garden, a garden that had been started with agricultural advice from our hero's father, the veteran farmer. These seeds had been shared with other villages, creating a network of sustainable food programs. "From these small seeds," she said through her translator, "we have grown not just food, but hope." A group of military psychologists presented their findings on what they called the ripple effect of positive action. Their research showed that soldiers who engaged in community development alongside their regular duties showed higher morale, better stress management, and a stronger sense of purpose. What started as one soldier's instinct to help, one psychologist explained, has evolved into a model for military mental health and community relations. The Secretary of the Army revealed that this approach had influenced military recruitment and training. Young people were increasingly drawn to service not just for traditional reasons, but because they saw the military as a way to make a positive difference in the world. "We're seeing a new kind of warrior," he said, "one who understands that true strength lies in the ability to build bridges, not just defend walls." Our hero, still standing at attention, found his thoughts drifting to his first days in the military. He had enlisted wanting to serve, to protect, but he had found something more profound. He had discovered that the greatest service often comes in small moments of human connection, in choices made not because they are heroic, but because they are right. The journalist who had uncovered the story shared her most surprising finding. In all her interviews, across multiple countries and cultures, she had never found anyone who could tell her exactly how many lives had been impacted by these programs. "It's not because the numbers aren't impressive," she explained. "It's because the change keeps spreading, like ripples in a pond, touching lives we may never know about." As the sun began to set, casting a golden light across the parade ground, the base chaplain called for a moment of silence. In that quiet moment, something remarkable happened. From somewhere in the crowd, someone began to hum a simple tune. Others joined in, Americans, Afghans, soldiers, civilians, until the melody became a spontaneous expression of shared humanity. The Afghan children who had been saved years ago, now young adults, stepped forward one last time. They had prepared something special, something that would serve as both a tribute and a promise for the future. The young adults who had once been children in that fateful rescue stepped to the center of the parade ground. They carried with them a small sapling, a tree from their village, carefully transported across continents. But this was no ordinary tree. It was grown from a seed of the ancient tree that had stood in their village center for generations, the same tree that had survived countless conflicts and witnessed their rescue years ago. "In our culture," the eldest explained, her voice clear and strong, "we believe that trees carry the memories of all they have witnessed. This sapling comes from a tree that saw both the worst and best of humanity. We ask permission to plant it here, so it may witness the continuation of this story." The base commander, moved by the gesture, immediately granted permission. As the sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, a remarkable scene unfolded. American soldiers and Afghan villagers worked together to dig the hole and plant the sapling, their hands joining in the soil, a powerful symbol of cooperation and growth. Our hero was finally asked to speak. For a moment, he stood silent, looking at the faces before him, his parents, his fellow soldiers, the people he had helped, and those who had carried their work forward. When he spoke, his words were simple but profound. "I never wanted recognition," he began, his voice steady but humble. "On that day in Kandahar, I wasn't thinking about medals or ceremonies. I was thinking about my father's words when I enlisted. He told me, service isn't about what you do when everyone's watching. It's about what you do because it needs to be done." He paused, looking at the newly planted sapling. "But standing here today, I understand that this isn't really about me. It's about what happens when we stop seeing each other as enemies or strangers, and start seeing each other as people. It's about what's possible when we choose to believe in something bigger than our fears." The Afghan grandmother who had been saved that day approached him, carrying something wrapped in silk. As she unwrapped it, everyone saw it was his father's silver cross, the one he had given her years ago. But it had been transformed, local artisans had incorporated it into a larger piece, combining traditional Afghan designs with the original silver work. It had become a symbol of how two cultures could come together, creating something new while honoring both traditions. "We return this to you," she said through her translator, "not because we don't want it, but because we have learned its lesson. Protection doesn't come from a piece of metal, it comes from the connections we build with each other." The Secretary of the Army then revealed the final surprise of the day. The military was establishing a new award, named after our hero, but with a unique twist. It wouldn't be given for single acts of bravery, but for sustained efforts to build peace and understanding between cultures. The first recipients would be the village leaders who had carried forward the work that began that day in Kandahar. As if on cue, a group of children from the base school arrived, carrying small potted plants, cuttings from the original sapling. These would be sent to military bases around the world, creating a living network of reminder trees, each one a symbol of the power of compassion and the possibility of change. Our hero's father, the quiet Vietnam veteran, stepped forward one last time. He removed his own service medal and pinned it to his son's chest. "When I came home from war," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I carried memories I couldn't talk about. You taught me that the greatest victory isn't winning the battle, it's creating a world where fewer battles need to be fought." The journalist who had uncovered the story made one final observation. "In journalism," she said, "we're taught to look for the dramatic moments, the big gestures. But this story taught me that real change often begins with small acts of kindness, multiplied over time, carried forward by countless hands." As the ceremony drew to a close, the base commander read a quote that had been discovered in our hero's original field notebook: "Every act of kindness is a seed. We may not be here to see it grow, but that doesn't make it any less worth planting." The sun had almost set now, casting long shadows across the parade ground. The newly planted sapling stood tall, its young leaves catching the last rays of light. Around it, American soldiers and Afghan civilians, military leaders and village elders, parents and children, all stood together, witnesses to something remarkable. Our hero took one last look at the gathering, at the tapestry that told their story, at the sapling that would grow into a mighty tree, at the faces of those whose lives had intertwined with his in ways he never could have imagined. He understood now that true heroism isn't about a single moment of courage, but about the countless small choices that follow, the daily decision to believe in possibility, to work for change, to plant seeds of hope even in the hardest soil. As people began to disperse, the Afghan children's choir sang one last song, a melody that blended their traditional music with the military hymn, creating something entirely new. The notes floated on the evening air, a reminder that when hearts and hands join together, extraordinary things are possible. The story of the unsung hero had finally been told, but in many ways, it was just beginning. For in every military base where a sapling grew, in every village where a school stood, in every life touched by this chain of events, the story would continue, a living testament to the power of choosing compassion over fear, understanding over prejudice, and hope over despair.